Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Back with me is NBC News terrorism analyst Evan Coleman.
He is Samuel Laurent, live from Paris. He is the author of The Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in France.
Joining me now, terrorism expert Steve Emerson.
Inside the world of terrorism experts, who are the pundits the corporate media relies on to analyze world events, from the Paris attacks to the U.S. wars in the Middle East? We'll speak with Glenn Greenwald and Harvard professor Lisa Stampnitsky, author of Disciplining Terror: How Experts Invented Terrorism. Then, as the French magazine Charlie Hebdo publishes its first issue since last week's attacks, we look at press freedom with the head of Reporters Without Borders just in from Paris. Then to Nigeria.
There are wildly differing accounts of the numbers. I mean, you're going from 100 to 2,000. We haven't been able to verify that. Well, what is clear is that eyewitnesses are saying, I mean, one eyewitness was talking about how when he was fleeing, he was tripping on bodies the whole way. So clearly, a large number of people were killed.
As many as 2,000 people are feared dead in an attack by militants from Boko Haram in the northeastern Nigerian town of Baja. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. France is deploying an unprecedented 10,000 soldiers inside its own country in the wake of last week's deadly shootings at a kosher grocery store in the magazine Charlie Hebdo. The soldiers will join nearly 5,000 police officers mobilized to guard Jewish schools, train stations, and other sites. France is also taking steps to increase electronic spying. Authorities say several members of a terrorist cell suspected in the attacks may still be at large. Video footage appears to show Ayat Boumediene, the partner of supermarket shooter Amadi Coulibaly, arriving in Turkey days before the Turkish attack. Turkish authorities say she went to a part of Syria controlled by the Islamic State. As the victims of the killings are laid to rest, the magazine Charlie Hebdo is preparing to publish its first post-attack issue Wednesday. The cover features the Prophet Muhammad holding a sign that reads, "Je suis Charlie," or "I am Charlie," with the headline, quote, "All is forgiven." Secretary of State John Kerry's announced he'll fly to Paris later this week in a show of support for France. The Obama administration's come under fire after President Obama declined to join 40 world leaders and 1.7 million people at a free speech rally in Paris Sunday. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest acknowledged the administration should have sent a top official.
Some have asked whether or not the United States should have sent someone with a higher profile than the ambassador to France. And I think it's fair to say that we should have sent someone with a higher profile to be there. That said, there is no doubt that the American people and this administration stand foursquare behind our allies in France as they face down this threat.
It's unclear why Attorney General Eric Holder, who was in Paris for meetings, did not attend the rally. In Germany, a record 25,000 people joined an anti-Islam rally in the city of Dresden. The far-right group Pegida has held weekly rallies against Islam, but Monday's was the largest to date. Some marchers carried signs that read "Je suis Charlie" in purported solidarity with the Charlie Hebdo victims. The anti-Islam movement appears to be spreading after the attacks, with hundreds rallying in Oslo, Norway, Monday, and more actions planned in Austria and Switzerland. But across Germany, an estimated 100,000 people joined counter-protests against Islamophobia, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel called for unity.
Ja, von meiner Seite möchte ich sagen, dass
I would like to add that our former president, Christian Wulff, said that Islam belongs to Germany. This is true. I share this view. That's why we are doing everything we can to make integration a success.
Chancellor Merkel attended the Sunday rally in Paris and is expected to attend a rally today organized by Muslim groups to denounce both terrorism and intolerance. Nigeria said the death toll from an attack by Boko Haram in the northeast stands at 150, including a number of militants, despite reports the toll may be far higher. The government's previously been accused of downplaying such tolls. Local officials say as many as 2,000 people may have been killed when Boko Haram attacked Baga and the surrounding area in what may be its deadliest attack to date. The Islamist militant group is also suspected in a pair of suicide attacks over the weekend where explosives were strapped to young girls. Cameroon, meanwhile, says it killed 143 Boko Haram militants who attacked a base near the Nigerian border. The Obama administration will not force New York Times investigative reporter James Risen to testify at the trial of his alleged source. Jeffrey Sterling, whose trial is set to open today, is accused of giving Risen secret information that revealed a botched CIA plot to disrupt Iran's nuclear program. Risen had risked jail time as part of a 7-year legal battle with the administration in a case that came to symbolize its crackdown on whistleblowers. The Obama administration's pursued more leak cases than all its predecessors combined. Hackers claiming allegiance to the Islamic State have penetrated the social media accounts of the U.S. military's Central Command, which oversees U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria. Central Command shut down its YouTube and Twitter accounts after a series of posts sympathetic to ISIS. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest downplayed comparisons between Monday's hack and the earlier data breach against Sony Pictures, which the administration blames on North Korea.
I can tell you this is something that we're obviously looking into and something that we take seriously. However, just a note of caution to folks as they're covering this story. There's a pretty significant difference between what is a large data breach and the hacking of a Twitter account.
A New Mexico prosecutor has filed murder charges against 2 police officers for the killing of a mentally ill homeless man, which ignited protests against the Albuquerque Police Department. The officers, Keith Sandy and Dominique Perez, will now face a public preliminary hearing before a judge for the killing of James Boyd last March. Boyd had been confronted by police for sleeping in an unauthorized campsite. Police say he was armed with knives, but video from a police helmet camera shows Boyd apparently agreeing to surrender and turning away to pick up his belongings before officers fire a flashbang grenade, release a dog on him, and open fire. At a news conference, District Attorney Carrie Brandenburg said proceedings against the officers would be more transparent than the secret grand juries in other states, which declined to indict the officers who killed Michael Brown and Eric Garner.
Unlike Ferguson and unlike in New York City, some recent high-profile cases, we're going to know. The public's going to have that information. You all are going to have seen the witnesses, heard the argument, and you'll understand, hopefully, perhaps why the judge made the decision that he or she made.
Albuquerque police have been involved in more than 40 shootings since 2010, 27 of them fatal. Last year, a scathing Justice Department probe found most of the department's fatal shootings were unconstitutional. It's the first time Albuquerque police involved in a shooting have faced murder charges. In New York City, a new report has found police have continued to use chokeholds like the one used against Eric Garner, even though they've been banned for over 20 years. The report looked at 10 cases of banned chokeholds over the past 5 years. While a review board had recommended the highest levels of punishment in 9 of the cases, most of the officers, the most they ever faced was a loss of vacation days. Lawmakers in the U.S. Senate have advanced legislation to approve the Keystone XL oil pipeline, despite a vow by President Obama to veto it. A final vote is expected on Friday. Wisconsin Republican Congressmember Paul Ryans announced he'll not run for president in 2016. The former vice presidential candidate, known for promoting deep cuts in public spending, says he wants to pay undivided attention to his new post as chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Ryans' former running mate, 2012 Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, has signaled he may run again and reportedly has begun contacting backers in key states. A Wall Street banker tapped by President Obama for a top post at the Treasury Department has removed himself from the running following opposition from progressives led by Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. Warren had criticized the nomination of Antonio Weiss, who spent 20 years at the financial firm Lazard, where he worked on so-called tax inversions, whereby companies like Burger King have moved overseas to dodge U.S. taxes. More than 160,000 people had signed a petition calling for the Senate to reject Weiss's nomination to the third highest post at Treasury. After withdrawing from consideration for that post, he's taken a job as counselor to Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. And a federal judge has struck down South Dakota's ban on same-sex marriage. Judge Karen Schreier found the ban, quote, deprives same-sex citizens of a fundamental right, but placed her ruling on hold pending an appeal. Same-sex marriage is currently legal in 36 states and Washington, D.C. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. As we continue to cover the fallout from last week's attacks in Paris, we turn now to look at the growing field of so-called terrorism experts.
With me is NBC News terrorism analyst Evan Coleman.
The cleavages that exist in French society between Muslims and non-Muslims are far more severe than they exist here in the United States.
He is Samuel Laurent, live from Paris. He is the author of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in France.
The landscape of jihadism and terrorism is deeply changing, and it's proving to be a much harder task than it used to be for the intelligence service, because it's very, very difficult now to spot and to stop the threat.
Joining me now, terrorism expert Steve Emerson.
Throughout Europe, Sean, you have no-go zones. When I was in Brussels a year ago, when I asked the police to take me to the Islamic zone or the Islamic community area, they refused. They say, we don't go there. This goes on in Belgium. This goes on in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in France. It goes on in Italy. I mean, it goes on throughout Europe. So there are no-go zones.
A few of the so-called terrorism experts who have appeared on television over the past week. That last voice was Stephen Emerson, who made international headlines this weekend after this appearance on Jeanine Pirro's show on Fox News.
Developing tonight, new reports that terrorist sleeper cells may have been activated in France. This is we're learning new details about hundreds of no-go zones across France and other countries that are off limits to non-Muslims. Steve Emerson, founder of the investigative project, joins us.
These no-go zones exist not only in France, but they exist throughout Europe. They're sort of amorphous. They're not contiguous necessarily, but they're sort of safe havens, and they're places where the governments like France, Britain, Sweden, Germany, they don't exercise any sovereignty. So you basically have zones where Sharia courts are set up, where Muslim density is very intense, where the police don't go in, and where it's basically a separate country almost, a country within a country.
You know what it sounds like to me, Steve? It sounds like a caliphate within a particular country.
Well, it certainly does sound like that. And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in.
Well, Steve Emerson claimed the British city of Birmingham was totally Muslim. It's, in fact, a predominantly Christian city. Emerson, who describes himself as, quote, one of the leading authorities on Islamic extremist networks, appeared on the BBC Monday and apologized.
I relied on incorrect research. It was totally irresponsible for me not to have fact-checked the information that I obtained, and it was not done out of any malice, but out of total irresponsible journalistic practice, which I usually and uniformly don't practice.
Are you aware that our Prime Minister has called you a complete idiot?
Yes, I'm aware.
What does that make you feel?
Not great. You know, mistakes are made. What can I tell you?
Well, Steve Emerson is making headlines today. Many questions have been raised about the entire field of so-called terrorism experts. Another so-called expert, Evan Coleman, has been described as the Doogie Howser of terrorism for building a career based on essays he wrote on al-Qaeda as an undergrad. We're joined now by two guests who've closely analyzed this issue. Joining us from Boston is Lisa Stepnitsky. She's a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University and author of the book Disciplining Terror: How Experts Invented Terrorism. And from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, we're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, co-founder of The Intercept and author of No Place to Hide: Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. Glenn, let's begin with you. The terror attacks, the Paris attacks, took place last week, and the so-called terror experts are very prominent all over the networks. Can you talk about who we are hearing from?
The concept of terrorism is a very widely debated concept all over the world, and there are incredibly divergent opinions, even about what terrorism is, about who it is who's perpetrating it, about how it is that you define it and understand it, and whether or not there's even a meaningful definition of the term at all. And yet you have all of these so-called terrorism experts employed by leading American television networks, all of them really, and on whom most establishment newspapers rely, who are called terrorism experts and yet who are incredibly homogenous in their views because they spout the very homogenized American conception of all of those questions. It's an incredibly propagandized term. It's an incredibly propagandistic set of theories that they have, and that's really what these media outlets are doing, is they're masquerading pro-U.S. propaganda, pro-U.S. government propaganda, as expertise when it's really anything but. These are incredibly ideological people. They're very loyal to the view of the U.S. government about very controversial questions. They certainly have the right to express their opinions, but the pretense to expertise is incredibly fraudulent, and that's why they have not just Steve Emerson and the Fox News strain, but really all of them who are held up as the most prominent terrorism experts in the U.S. have a really shameful history of incredible error and all sorts of just very dubious claims, because they're really just rank propagandists.
And so, Glenn, what allows them to continue perpetuating these myths that you describe? What is the dynamic that allows this expert industry to keep going?
Well, there are several aspects to it. I mean, one is the United States government obviously has an interest in making people believe that its very particular and self-serving views of terrorism are not subjective or debatable, but are in fact just objective expertise. And so they do all sorts of things to prop these people up. They give them contracts. They pay them lots of money to teach people inside the government about terrorism. Really, most disturbingly of all, they continuously call them as quote-unquote experts at terrorism trials. And all of these experts then dutifully march forth and say whatever the government wants about the Muslim defendants who are on trial and help the government obtain conviction after conviction and get a lot of money in the process. Part of it is just the role that think tanks play in Washington, which is to lend this kind of intellectual artifice to whatever the government's policy is or whatever the government wants. And so you have a lot of them who work at think tanks like Brookings Institute, which employs Will McCants, who misled American media outlets into believing for a full day and then telling the world that the Anders Breivik attack in Norway was actually the work of a jihadist group. Even the more respectable ones are people who generally spout the conventional orthodoxies of the American government about terrorism, and therefore it's very much in the interest of the U.S. government and these media outlets to continue to depict them not as polemicists and highly opinionated, just participants in debates, but as actual academic experts. And that's where the fraudulent aspect comes in.
I want to bring in Professor Lisa Stepnitsky. Again, your book is called Disciplining Terror: How Experts Invented Terrorism. What do you mean by disciplining terror? You carried out one of the first empirical studies of these so-called terror experts on television.
That's right. So disciplining terror has a dual meaning. On the one hand, it refers to the attempts of states to get control over the problem of terrorism. On the other hand, it refers to the attempt to develop a discipline of terrorism studies. And that problematic field is the story that I'm telling in the book.
And what's your assessment of the merits of this field in terms of its level of expertise and its seriousness?
I mean, it's one of the conclusions I draw is that it's a very peculiar field in terms of fields of expertise, because there is no strict boundary around it. There is no control according to who can be an expert. There's no credentialing. And so you have people coming on TV who are just sort of spouting hysteria and not drawing on any real expert knowledge. And even those who are more serious in the field have no ability to regulate who gets called an expert.
In 2008, self-described terrorism consultant Evan Coleman was interviewed on the public radio news hour The Takeaway. Host John Hockenberry challenged Coleman on his level of expertise.
This is a far-ranging international conspiracy that began, as many as 2 decades ago, involved hundreds of different people spread around various different places in the world, and it's also based in a language and a culture that, to be honest with you, very few Americans are familiar with.
Right, and speaking of that, do you think now that the movie has been played in open court, then, you've achieved a certain amount of notoriety, that it might be time to learn Arabic, maybe go to Afghanistan or Pakistan, or familiarize yourself with the culture?
I have a degree in Islam, and I do speak some Arabic. I'm not fluent. But in terms of traveling to Pakistan, trying to do this research right now in Pakistan is extremely difficult. Trying to even get into Pakistan right now to do this is extremely difficult.
That's Evan Coleman, an NBC News analyst. Glenn Greenwald, your comment.
And there are so many of them like that. I mean, he's one of the people called by the U.S. government in these prosecutions, these really dubious prosecutions of American Muslims for really remote charges of material support for terrorism. And his expertise is basically just that he gets called an expert by the U.S. government. And the more he gets called to testify, the more that expertise builds. That's really the only foundation for it, is that some people call him an expert because it's in their interest to do so. There's another one like him, Matthew Levitt, who was profiled in Harper's, who has a long history of unbelievably erroneous claims that he makes in service of this agenda. They get paid a lot of money, too. I mean, he goes on, they go on NBC News, they get held up as a terrorism analyst, they get paid for that, they get called as an expert in court, and yet, as that tape said, and as Lisa said, there's really no foundation for the expertise. There's no PhDs that they have in terrorism studies. There's not even agreement about what the word terrorism means, which is why the old cliche that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist is though cliched, is so resoundingly true. You can have debates about what terrorism is, about who perpetrates it, and yet all of these so-called experts simply assume the answers to those questions, because if they were, for example, to say that the U.S. government is a state sponsor of terrorism by virtue of its support for death squads in El Salvador, or the Contras in Nicaragua, or any of the other groups across the United States, across the world that the United States continues to support, that engages in violence against civilians for political ends, you would immediately have them eliminated. No major network like CNN or MSNBC or NBC would ever call somebody like that a terrorism expert, even though that's a very plausible claim to make. It's an extremely ideological and politicized view that gets called expertise, and they don't even have the basic attributes of what we generally consider that makes somebody an expert.
Glenn, do you personally use the word terror, or do you avoid it entirely?
I generally avoid it. I mean, you could probably find instances in my writing where I've invoked the term, usually just ironically or to refer to the fact that somebody else is using it. But I do think that until we have an understanding of what the term means, it really is a term that ought to be avoided. There's some amazingly great scholarly research by Remy Berlin, who was at the Sorbonne and then NYU, where he traces essentially the history of this term in political discourse. And what he has described in a very scholarly way is that the term terrorism really entered and became prevalent in the discourse of international affairs in the late 60s and the early 70s, when the Israelis sought to use the term to universalize their disputes with their neighbors. So they could say, we're not fighting the Palestinians and we're not bombing Lebanon over just some land disputes. We're fighting this concept that is a grave menace to the world called terrorism. And it's not only our fight, it's your fight in the United States, and it's your fight in Europe, and it's your fight around the world. And there are all these conferences in the late 60s and early 70s and into the 1980s even, where Israelis and Americans and neocons are attempting to come up with a definition of the term terrorism that includes the violence that they want to delegitimize, meaning the violence by their adversaries, while legitimizing, excluding the violence they want to legitimize, namely our violence, the violence of Israel, the violence of our allies. And it was virtually impossible to come up with a definition, and that's why there really is no agreed upon definition. The term is incredibly malleable because it's typically just meant as a term that says any violence we don't like is something we're going to call terrorism. And at this point, it really just means violence engaged in by Muslims against the West. That's really the definition of the term terrorism, the functional definition. It has no fixed definition.
Glenn, I remember at the beginning, at the Oklahoma City bombing attack, when two names of Arab men were floated. It turned out they were New York taxi drivers who'd gone to Oklahoma City to renew their licenses. But those names were put out by the media, and then there was the question, was this a terrorist attack? When it turned out it was Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, who worked with other people, had all the, all the definition of a terrorist attack. Then it wasn't. Oh, no, it was Timothy McVeigh. And he did this. A white Christian man. No longer did we refer to it as a terrorist attack.
Right. I mean, that happens all the time. And first of all, it was Steve Emerson, the very same Steve Emerson who just said that Birmingham was an all-Muslim city, that no non-Muslims can enter, who was working at the time, either at the time for CNN or just afterwards, who went on the air and was the most influential comment shaping what you just described. And he said, the attempt here was to kill as many people as possible, which is a Middle East attribute. And therefore, we should assume or highly speculate that this is likely an attack perpetrated by someone from the Middle East, someone who is Muslim. That's how that narrative actually started. Steve Emerson's career didn't suffer at all from that. But, you know, if you watch how these attacks are discussed, every time there's an attack where the assailant or the perpetrator is unknown, the media will say it's unknown whether or not terrorism is involved. And what they really mean by that is it's unknown whether or not the perpetrator is Muslim. And as soon as they discover that the perpetrator is a Christian or is American, white American, they'll say, we now have confirmation that this is not a terrorist attack. It's something else, someone who's mentally unstable, some extremist, something like that. It really is a term that functionally now means nothing other than Muslims who engage in violence against the West.
We have a perfect example right now in Colorado Springs. There was a bomb that was affixed that blew up outside the NAACP. The media is not saying right now, as the man is looked for, there is a search for terrorists going on right now on our own soil in Colorado.
Yeah, I remember there was an individual named Joseph Stack who flew an airplane into a government building in Texas, into the side of the IRS, actually. And for the first several hours of the reporting, it was said that the suspicion is that this is a terrorist attack because it was on a government facility. And then when it was discovered that he was actually a right-wing, anti-tax, anti-government American, they said, actually, this isn't a terrorist attack. This is just kind of this crazy person who did this for political ends. You know, I was in Canada about 2 months ago when those two attacks happened. First, one in Quebec, and then the other one at the Parliament in Ottawa. And the first one in the outskirts of Quebec was two people who had waited 2 hours in a car to see a soldier, a Canadian soldier, and then targeted him and ran him over. And that was instantly branded a terrorist attack, even though they purposely avoided targeting civilians and targeted a soldier of a country that is at war. It really is a term that is so muddled and confused in terms of how it's used, and it is used for very specific agendas and very ideological purposes.
Break and then come back to this discussion. We're talking to Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. We're also speaking with Lisa Stempnitsky. She is a lecturer at Harvard University, author of Disciplining Terror, How Experts Invented Terrorism. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. Our guests are Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, Lisa Stampnitsky of Harvard University, who wrote the book Disciplining Terror. And we're joined from Paris by Luc Mathieu, the foreign affairs reporter for the French newspaper Libération, who has written critically of so-called terrorism expert Samuel Laurent. He appeared on CNN last week with host Brooke Baldwin. This is Samuel Laurent.
Samuel Laurent, live from Paris. He is the author of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in France. So, Samuel, nice to see you, sir. Here's my question. You know, Fareed was making the point about how this totally seems to be changing the game, the face of terror. These are, you know, seemingly local, perhaps fringe natives from perhaps a much larger organization. When you watch the video, very trained. What's your read on this?
Well, basically, what you have to understand is that the situation has changed a lot from the time of Al-Qaeda. Basically, Al-Qaeda was operating cells. They were breeding them, and they were targeting a specific objective. Nowadays, with the Islamic State, what has changed is that the Caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is supposed to be the leader of the believers. So therefore, he issues some orders at wide. And basically, some of his orders in October, in November, has been to kill the French by any possible means. That was his words.
That's Samuel Laurent, often seen on CNN. Luc Mathieu, you're with the French newspaper Libération. You have written about who Samuel Laurent is. Can you talk about him?
Well, it's difficult to talk about him because he's not a journalist. He's not an analyst. He's not a former diplomat. He's not a former member of intelligence community. I mean, he's describing himself as an international consultant, which doesn't mean nothing. So he wrote like 3 books, and one was particularly interesting. It was Al-Qaeda in France. So I investigate on that book, and basically nothing is holding together. I mean, facts are not matching. Places he's supposed to go are not matching. So there are a lot of mistakes and a lot of approximations and a lot of nonsense in his books.
Lisa Stampnitsky, I want to ask you, what do you think the experts are missing? What issues should they be looking at that the so-called experts are not?
I mean, I think one of the key difficulties is, as Glenn mentioned, that there is no settled definition of what terrorism is, and that insofar as there is a common understanding of what terrorism is, it tends to be that it's violence that we don't like. And one of the most interesting things that I show in my book is that that wasn't always the case. I look at debates on terrorism from the 1970s until 2001. And if you look at when people were first starting to talk about terrorism in the early 1970s, they were talking about it in a very different way. So Glenn mentioned this cliche, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And that seems almost obvious today that these are opposed, that you can't be a terrorist and a freedom fighter. But if you look at the way that people were talking about terrorism or political violence of this sort in the late 60s and early 1970s, this wasn't considered to be an opposition. There wasn't this assumption that acts of terror as a tactic were necessarily something that was done by people who we think are evil. There was not this moral overlay over it. And this has come to be understood as so basic to understanding of terrorism now that it really clouds any attempt to understand the issue.
And let me go back to Luc in Paris. First of all, our condolences, and what you're writing about right now in Libération, what you feel these terrorism experts do not bring us, that we should understand about what's happening in France.
It's perhaps too early to say to be sure of it. We have to look back at Al-Qaeda history because it comes from Al-Qaeda in Yemen. We have to look deeply into Islamic State because one of the 3 assailants said he was from Islamic State. So it's a very messy right now in France because a lot of people are trying to know exactly where those guys come from, where they went, what they wanted to do exactly. So it's a bit early to say, I think, we are missing that, we are still searching a lot.
I want to go back to Fox News host Jeanine Pirro, a former prosecutor. This is from her show on Saturday.
We need to kill them. We need to kill them. The radical Muslim terrorists hell-bent on killing us. You're in danger. I'm in danger. We're at war, and this is not going to stop. After this week's brutal terror attacks in France, hopefully everybody now gets it. And there's only one group that can stop this war: the Muslims themselves. Our job is to arm those Muslims to the teeth, give them everything they need to take out these Islamic fanatics. Let them do the job. Let them have at it. And as they do, we need to simply look the other way.
That's Jeanine Pirro of Fox News, a former prosecutor in Westchester, also a former judge. Glenn Greenwald, it's easy to make fun of Fox News, but your response to this, and how do attitudes like these play out in the corporate media generally?
I mean, you know, if you listen to her, Jeanine Pirro, that clip you just played, I mean, she's obviously psychotic. I mean, that's just like bloodthirsty fascism in its purest, expression. But I don't really think that the substance of what she's saying, to the extent one can attribute substance to those comments, is really all that rare or even controversial in the U.S. I mean, we have been a country that has declared ourselves at war with some formulation of Islam, radical Muslims, whatever you want to call it, something that John Kerry actually just affirmed a few days ago that the French president and others have embraced as well over the last week. And I think this is one of the most pernicious aspects of these so-called terrorism experts and terrorism expertise, which is if you are an American citizen, or if you're a French citizen, or if you're a British citizen, you have a greater chance of being killed by slipping in the bathtub tonight and hitting your head on the ceramic tile, or being struck by lightning, literally, than you do dying in a terrorist attack. And yet these terrorism experts have it in their interest to constantly hype and exaggerate the threat and fearmonger over it, because that's how they become relevant. They become relevant in terms of their work, they become relevant in terms of their government contracts, and in terms of the money that they make. And it really has infected large parts of Western thinking to view terrorism as a much, much greater threat than just rationally and statistically it really is. And I think that's a big part of that is at the feet of these so-called terrorism experts.
I want to thank Luc Mathieu, speaking to us from Paris, from La Libération. I also want to thank Lisa Stepnitsky, who wrote Disciplining Terror, speaking to us from Boston, Harvard lecturer. But Glenn, I'd like to ask you to stay with us to talk about another issue. I want to ask you about General Petraeus. The FBI and federal prosecutors have recommended felony charges against former CIA Director David Petraeus for allegedly providing classified information to a woman with whom he had an extramarital affair. Petraeus resigned in 2012 after admitting to cheating on his wife with his biographer, Paula Broadwell. The recommendation of charges stems from a probe into whether Petraeus gave Broadwell access to a CIA email account and other sensitive material. Before leaving the CIA, General Petraeus directed troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Attorney General Eric Holder was supposed to have decided by the end of last year on whether to indict. According to the New York Times, the delay has frustrated some federal officials, quote, who've questioned whether Petraeus has received special treatment at a time Holder has led a crackdown, unquote, on government whistleblowers. Speaking on CNN Sunday, Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California urged the Department of Justice not to bring criminal charges against General Petraeus.
This man has suffered enough, in my view. He's the four-star general of our generation. I saw him in Iraq. He put together the Army Field Manual. He put together the awakening and how it worked out. He, I think, is a very brilliant man. People aren't perfect. He made a mistake. He lost his job as CIA director because of it. I mean, how much do you want to punish somebody?
That's Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein saying General Petraeus isn't perfect. He's a very brilliant man, so he shouldn't be indicted. Your response to this, Glenn Greenwald?
I mean, even though Dianne Feinstein is a really good Democrat, and even though what she just said, she used just kind of soft tones to say it, that's actually one of the most disgusting remarks you'll ever hear. And I mean, I didn't actually even realize the full extent of that until I just heard that video. I had only seen the transcript. What she's actually saying there is that because David Petraeus is a really important person, she says he's a four-star general, the four-star general of our generation, and a very brilliant man, that he should be immunized from consequences for his law-breaking. He suffered enough. Now, what's so amazing about that is that, first of all, the United States imprisons more of its citizens than any other country in the world for trivial transgressions. You would never hear Dianne Feinstein or any of those people in Washington saying about ordinary people, oh, they've suffered enough, they've lost their jobs, they've been taken away from their family, let's free them from prison. But the more amazing thing is Dianne Feinstein is someone who's called for the prosecution of all sorts of leakers, and yet she exempts David Petraeus.
And explain what General Petraeus did. Interestingly, perhaps brought down by the very surveillance you criticize, Glenn.
Right. I mean, what David Petraeus did actually wasn't that bad. I mean, what he essentially is accused of doing is sharing classified information with his mistress and biographer, Paula Broadwell. And if you were to say to me just in a vacuum, should David Petraeus face felony charges for that behavior, I would probably say no. It was pretty benign. It was something he shouldn't have done, but it doesn't strike me as a really serious violation. The problem is that the Obama administration has prosecuted a whole array of leakers and put them in prison for behavior at least as innocuous, if not much more so. Stephen Kim, who was allegedly Fox News' source for a very harmless leak on North Korea, is sitting in prison. Of course, they've charged Edward Snowden with felony charges, even though there's zero evidence of any national security harm. He didn't actually leak anything to the public. He only gave it to journalists. Dianne Feinstein wrote an op-ed calling for Julian Assange to be prosecuted for exposing war crimes under the Espionage Act. She wants him prosecuted. And so you have this whole array of people who have been put in prison for leaking classified information.
Chelsea Manning's been sentenced to what, more than 35 years?
35 years in prison, and Dianne Feinstein supports that prosecution. And so you have these noble leakers who have not harmed national security, endangered nobody, and have been put into prison or threatened with prison for a very long time. And you have David Petraeus, who all of Washington is now acting to protect because he's a political elite and one of them, and they don't believe they or people like them should be subjected to the rule of law, which is what makes that Dianne Feinstein mentality so dangerous.
Glenn Greenwald, we want to thank you for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. His recent pieces for The Intercept include Dianne Feinstein, strong advocate of leak prosecutions, demands immunity for David Petraeus, and In Solidarity with the Free Press, some more blasphemous cartoons. His most recent book, No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. And we'll link to it at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the head of Reporters Without Borders has just flown in from Paris. We'll speak with her, and then we'll talk about what's happened in Nigeria. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
The group Reporters Without Borders is condemning what it calls the presence of predators in Sunday's march over the Charlie Hebdo massacre. The group says it is, quote, appalled by the presence of leaders from countries where journalists and bloggers are systematically persecuted, such as Egypt, Russia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia joined other Arab and Muslim countries in condemning the attack at the same time as it faced global outrage at the public lashing of jailed blogger Raif Badawi.
On Friday, Badawi received the first 50 of 1,000 lashes for his punishment for running a liberal website devoted to freedom of speech in the conservative kingdom. One cartoon shared on social networks shows a pencil being flayed by whips. Amnesty International considers Badawi a prisoner of conscience who's being punished for creating an online forum for debate. Well, joining us now in our New York studio are two guests. Lucie Marion is the program director for Reporters Without Borders, based in Paris. She arrived in the United States Monday after attending Sunday's march. She heads back to Paris tonight. She was at the site of the Charlie Hebdo attack shortly after it occurred. And with us also Delphine Algan, U.S. Director of Reporters Without Borders. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Lucie, how did you get to the site of the attack so quickly?
Well, at Reporters Without Borders, we were having a meeting with our director and my deputy, and one of my colleagues came in and he was waving at us saying something's happening. So we told him to come in with us. I was looking at him saying, like, this better be important because we are discussing important matters. And obviously it was. He said, we have done something terrible. It looks like they have been fired, shots fired at Charlie Hebdo's offices in Paris, and there might be dead people. So the first thing we did was to grab bags, notebooks, and to run to the scene. When we arrived, there were very, very few people. We arrived before the official delegation, the Ministry of Interior, the Mayor of Paris, and we were able to, me and our General Director, Christophe Deloire, we were able to get into the restricted areas with the officials. They knew who we are, and they thought it was important that Reporters Without Borders was there. So we were in front of the office. There were still bullets on the ground. It was just very chaotic. And at some point, we were just wondering who's dead, what happened, and a man left the office, and he just went into President Hollande's arms. He burst into tears, and he was saying, "Charb est mort." Charb is dead. He's the editor of Charlie Hebdo.
And talk about the response that we've seen in France since over 3.7 million people marching on Sunday, a record for France.
Absolutely. This attack, this deadly attack, was an unprecedented attack on journalists and media in France, but the response from the French society has been amazing. We've never seen that many people taking to the streets to call for freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and against all of those who are trying to silence journalists. And in the different gathering, we talked about Sunday, but it started on Wednesday. Reporters Without Borders and others called for a demonstration. It's the very evening of that black day, and people went to the streets, like hundreds of thousands of people, and they were, of all origin, all ages, with people who would read Charlie Hebdo and others who would not read or not like what they would publish, but at least they deemed that they had the right to do it, and that they should not be losing their lives for it.
Among the many signs, a French Muslim woman holding a sign, "Je suis juif," I am Jewish.
Absolutely. It started with Charlie, and then we had this terrible shooting and hostage-taking situation in this cashier shop in Paris. And the crowd was singing on Sunday, "I am a journalist, I am Charlie, I am a Jew, I am a policeman." And again, that was, people from all origins. And they were also saying, "Je suis Ahmed," who is the Muslim police officer who was shot dead. Absolutely. The crowd was, and from the very early gatherings, the crowd was cheering for journalists, but also for police who fell to protect our right to freedom of information. So you flew into New York, and you're flying right out back to Paris. Why are you here? Right. Well, I flew in because last night we had a very important thing to do in New York. There was a gathering organized by one of our board members for an American journalist. His name is Austin Tice. He's been missing in Syria for over 2 years, and last evening was an opportunity to call for American news organizations and people to try to help us raise awareness about this case. There's a campaign to be launched soon by the advertising agency JWT with a blindfold. The idea is to ask for news outlets to run on their website a blindfold to show that when journalists like Austin Tice are missing, taken hostage, or targeted, this is our right to information that is targeted. This is all of us that are being blindfolded. What is the U.S. government doing about Austin Tice? Well, that's a good question. We'd like to know more about what they are doing. For now, we are really frustrated that there are no such information coming out, and this is a way. The more media coverage there will be, the more pressure on the American authorities. Delphine Algan, we last had you on Democracy Now! Talking about the crackdown on journalists in the United States. Can you talk about this in light of what we're seeing now in France?
I think we all have been very moved to see so much support from the U.S. administration and from the American citizens. All these gatherings in New York, in Washington, have really been relayed in France and are very important. And I think all French people know that American people are with us, in a sense, to defend our freedom. Yes, press freedom is not perfect in the U.S. Press freedom is not perfect in France. But today, on Sunday, millions of people walked in the street in France, all around the world, to show that maybe terrorists can kill journalists, but they will never kill our freedom.
I'm wondering if this moment in France will lead to any kind of self-reflection in terms of the criticisms that have been leveled against Charlie Hebdo for its depiction of Muslims. They, in large part, they're the underclass. They feel stigmatized already, and that, critics say, contributes to the insensitivity of Charlie Hebdo and how Muslims were depicted. No one questions the right to free expression, but does an attack like this, does that lead to maybe some rethinking of how Muslims are caricatured in publications like Charlie Hebdo?
I think you should just look at all the Muslims who were gathering in the street on Sunday and who were saying, maybe I disagree with what you were saying, but I'm here to say that you had the right to say it. And I really believe that that's the freedom that we are defending, and that's the fight we are here continuing.
But what about the fact that you do have laws against anti-Semitism, and Charlie Hebdo has been accused of censoring people or firing someone who wrote something that was considered anti-Semitic?
So, Charlie Hebdo was is a very provocative satirical weekly. They were mocking all religions, and they are mocking all religions, all politics, and they will continue to do so. And that's, I think, the important message.
Yeah, I mean, we all often ask if they went too far, if they pushed the envelope on freedom of expression, but no, they just exercise this freedom of expression. Even in France, you point out to the laws we have, it is forbidden to call for hatred, to call for violence, to stigmatize people, but you can criticize religion. There's a difference between criticizing religion and going after people criticizing Muslims, Jews, and so on. The last time Charlie Hebdo was sued, they won this case. So it means that, even under French law, it was fine, and even under international standards, what they were doing was really freedom of expression. They were not abusing it, as we've heard. And it's important, again, that French journalists continue to tackle these issues. The last thing we should do is to resort to self-censorship. Otherwise, I think all of the people who died for that would just not recognize what the French media might become. That is the next challenge.
We want to thank you both for joining us. Lucie Marion is Reporters Without Borders Program Director in Paris, heading back now. Also, Delphine Algan, also French, the U.S. Director of Reporters Without Borders. And we'll link to your reports at democracynow.org as we move to our final story today. Aaron?
As the world focused on the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris, a massive atrocity was unfolding in Nigeria. On January 3rd, the Islamist militant group Boko Haram attacked the northern town of Baga and surrounding areas. Over the next several days, hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians were killed. Fleeing residents were chased into the bush and shot dead. Others reportedly drowning in Lake Chad as they tried to swim away. Scores of homes were burned to the ground, and bodies were strewn in the streets. Estimates of the dead ranged from around 500 to up to 2,000. Some 30,000 people were also displaced.
Amnesty International says the assault on Baga could be the deadliest of the Boko Haram 6-year insurgency. For more, we're joined by Adete Akwe, Managing Director of Government Relations for Amnesty International USA, joining us from Washington. Adete, thank you for joining us. Talk about what you understand at this point has taken place in Nigeria.
Thank you for having me. As Aaron said, there was a major offensive by Boko Haram about 2 weekends ago. They overran the Nigerian forces, who ran out of supplies and basically started to flee. And Boko Haram, after consolidating control over the village of Baga, began to systematically execute people, first executing all potential male fighters that could oppose them, but then beginning a rather indiscriminate slaughter of the elderly, of people who could not flee. And to this day, we do not have access to Baga because it's too dangerous. The Nigerian forces have not tried to retake the town, and we're just trying to piece together information about how bad the killings were.
The Nigerian military responded to the Baga massacre by appealing for international support. In a statement, a government spokesperson suggested the attack should end critics of the army's own alleged abuses, saying, quote, "The attack should convince well-meaning people all over the world that Boko Haram is the evil all must collaborate to end, rather than vilifying those working to check them." Adete Akwe, this appears to be a message to groups like Amnesty International, who've accused the military of war crimes during its fight against Boko Haram and other armed groups.
That's absolutely correct. The Nigerian armed forces, as well as the administration, have had a very consistent line of demanding or requesting assistance on their terms. Amnesty International has documented at least 5,000 people who have been killed by the Nigerian security forces. We've also had reports we issued a report last fall about detention where torture was basically the modus operandi, and there have been no investigations and certainly no accountability. This has been the major impediment for assistance from the United States to the Nigerian military. And so it is rather stunning, or rather disappointing, but still stunning, that the Nigerian military is basically making the argument that the slaughter by Boko Haram is bad enough that it doesn't matter what methods they use, which of course leaves the Nigerian civilian population at increased risk.
Why the disparity in the number of people that are believed dead? The Nigerian government itself is saying like 150, 160 people. You're saying you believe 2,000 people were killed last week.
That is correct. And again, we're working with people who are providing information, of course, accurate, precise numbers will take some time to get to. But the Nigerian government has first initially downplayed the Boko Haram threat by underreporting numbers. Then they have they've also denied actual events have taken place. And they've also claimed certain counteroffensives that have never been proven to have actually occurred. So I think we're dealing with an administration and with security forces that are determined to control the narrative and the information, and I think that's a disservice to the Nigerian people.
Adete, what accounts for the Nigerian military's inability to stop these attacks? The Council of Foreign Relations says over 10,000 killed by the Boko Haram last year. It's been almost a year since over 200 schoolgirls were kidnapped, spawning the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. Most of them have not been found. Why have they been so incapable to do anything in the north?
There are a number of reasons. The first that almost everyone agrees on is that corruption has basically weakened the capacity of the military to operate. When Boko Haram seized Baga 2 weekends ago, the military ran out of ammunition, and then they had to flee. And that was a similar situation in other attacks on villages. So there's a capacity issue which the Nigerian military acknowledges but does not actually reveal the extent of which. The second, I think, is the morale issue.
We have 10 seconds.
Sure. The morale issue, I think, is reflective of some disquiet with the hardline response that targets males in the region as if they were Boko Haram supporters until they prove themselves innocent. And I think the third is just a question of the actual tactics.
Adete, we have to leave it there. Adete Akwe with Amnesty International. Of course, we'll continue to cover this issue. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mattes. Thanks so much for joining us.